So next up, we have Hamza Hadji, who will be speaking on Walter Rodney on the colonial epistemology of education and its impact on current African youth on the continent and abroad, language, tradition, and the brain drain. Just to introduce Hamza quickly, Hamza is a teaching fellow in the Communicating for Impact team at African Leadership University. He's a graduate of Kingston University, London, with a degree in politics and international relations. He's also got experience working as a consultant for small and medium enterprises and a support worker for university students with disabilities. He's a self-taught Pan-Africanist, a passionate African, and a strong believer that change in Africa lies in building a better education system, on a mission to decolonize the curriculum for Africans at home and abroad. So welcome, Hamza.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the previous speakers. My address is going to be a little bit different, so you guys can bear with me. The conclusion will make a lot more sense. I would like to start by stating that, once again, that my name is Hamza. I was born and raised in Rwanda. I grew up in a small town called Kamembe in the southwestern region of the country. The small town was known for the people who lived there. They were referred to as Baswahili, an indication that their main language of communication was Kiswahili, and most of them were predominantly Muslim. Part of my identity comes from this background, given that my father was born and raised in this town. My mother, on the other hand, is from a small town called Kibungo in the southeastern region of Rwanda, near the Tanzanian border. Born from a Tanzanian Muslim father and a Rwandan Christian mother, but her identity was predominantly influenced by Rwandan culture, to the detriment of her father's identity, which was Tanzanian. A reference to my mother's origin is simply for contextualization, for the further part of this address, as I will be using my own experience as a basis for my arguments. For now, I will mainly focus on my father's cultural identity, as it is the one that influenced my person despite being raised by my mother. This is given the realities of my father's culture, which specifically dictate that children should be raised in the image of their father, especially male children. Where my father's is from, and in consequence where I'm from, the Baswahili town of Kamembe, people were heavily influenced by Arabic culture. The Baswahili consider themselves civilized as opposed to the other Rwandans. They believe that the way they speak, dress, and carry themselves is superior to that of other Rwandans. They choose to alienate themselves and often look down on their fellow countrymen and women. Growing up, my understanding was that I should only speak Kiswahili, as it is the language of the civilized Muslim, given its origin in Arabic. Kinyarwanda was considered the language of the Bushmen. My father would say, "Usizungumze ile lugha, ni ya washamba," which means, "Do not speak that language, it's of the Bushmen." As problematic as this was, given the reality of my siblings and I growing up, we were unfortunately indoctrinated into adopting this belief. But as I became older, naturally, given the absence of my father as he worked abroad, the rebellious spirit in my siblings and I pushed us to speak Kinyarwanda when no one was around, to the point where we eventually acquired some sort of fluency in the language. As we went to school, originally attending a Rwandan public school, we were easily alienated as we were considered other. This whole idea of superiority was quickly crushed by the weight of estrangement. This shaped part of my identity. The other part was shaped by the type of education I received. As mentioned above, I initially attended a Rwandan public school. However, eventually given my father's stance on the civilized versus the Bushmen, my siblings and I were taken to school in the nearby Congo city of Bukavu. And here began my miseducation, what Rodney refers to as being Europeanized. I was to become assimilated. I didn't know it then, but I would find out eventually. However, as instability grows in the Congo, we were forced to move from my little hometown of Kamembe to Kigali, the capital city. There I attended both a French and a Belgian school. At school, I learned about the great achievements, conquest, social, economic, and political advancements of Europe. I learned about colonization in the perspective of the colonizer, or the colonial apologist, as Rodney calls them. By the third year of my high school education, I could name all the countries in the European Union and their capital cities. I still can, funnily enough. I could tell the tale of how Europe rose from the ashes of ignorance and went on a mission to save the rest of the world, almost like I had been there myself. Conversely, I could not name a single province in the country I was born and raised in. I had no understanding of the history my country had experienced, and I could barely speak the language. I knew nothing of the Songhai Empire, Dahomey, Kush, Timbuktu, Kemet, Zulu, the great kingdom of the Congo, and the like. I truly believed, even though it was never explicitly stated in my education, that the Africans had made no contribution to history whatsoever. I was to understand this later on as an adult, as Rodney explained that colonialism determined that Africans were no immune makers of history than were beetles, objects to be looked at under a microscope. This only furthered my alienation from my countrymen and women. To further the disconnect between my cultural identity, tradition, and I went to England to study political science and international relations. Before I go on, I would like to stress that I realize my social advantage and what Brother Chinedu was referring to as the petite bourgeoisie. I am a clear case study of that social class. And I would not like to be communicating that I'm not grateful for these experiences. However, the point I'm trying to make is not based on finances, rather on the way education shaped my identity. Anyways, I digress. As I was saying, I moved to England. My first surprise as I started my course was the lack of inclusion of the history of African people's positive contribution to the world, even in a course that was called International Relations. In most of the modules, Africa was painted as a continent of violence, hunger, and overall underdevelopment, except for one, which was Amanda Latimer's module, which I felt gave me the material and resources that consider the reality of not only African people, but all Black peoples, as Rodney refers to them in his other work, Groundings with My Brothers, where he emphasizes that Black peoples include all people who are subject to the ruthless oppressing fist of white imperialism. Amanda's course drew me to her. However, I was only able to form a true relationship with her as once I was in the middle of my third year and last year at university. I remember being in Amanda's office and she asked me as we discussed the history of my country, have you read Walter Rodney? And I said no. And she showed me the book, and I will never forget that moment because that moment shaped my understanding of life as it is right now and life as an African. I read the chapters on what is development, what is underdevelopment, and education for underdevelopment. And this is where I am right now. I have a clear understanding that there is a hidden curriculum that exists within the schools right after independence. So as Rodney discusses in his book, when we made the transition from being dependent to independent, we only copied and pasted everything that was happening in the colonial system into our systems today. And this is not something that I'm saying out of the top of my head. This is something I experienced every day on the continent. People do not understand their history. They believe that the closest they can become to being successful and to being purposeful and being completed is by coming closest to a European. As I said, and as Kevin introduced, I teach communicating for impact at university. One of my students came into my classroom and they said, "Sir, I don't understand the material." And I asked them, "Why don't you understand the material? Haven't you read over it multiple times?" And the student explained that the language was too advanced for them. They did not understand English. So what I proceeded to do is I explained the material in their home language. I explained the material in their mother tongue. And the student understood the material and was able to submit a work at a higher standard than they'd had done previously. And this is where it hit me. It was clear what Rodney was talking about. There has to be a complete and radical break with the capitalist system, not only in a political and economic sense, but on the cultural and traditional sense. Because as we moved closer to what we define as development, we're moving away to what defines us. I would like to end by saying that how my identity was shaped and where I am today is a clear proof of what Rodney was talking about. He talked about the fact that the colonial education was a system to perpetuate the colonial agenda and shape individuals that had no understanding of their culture and tradition. So here comes our mission. Our mission as people who've been educated is to take on the burden of clarifying these issues, clarifying the issues within the curriculum, and showing to the people, to the working masses, that this is not the truth. The truth is not to come the closest to Europeans. The truth is not that Europe was the center of history. The truth is that we were the original source of history, and they changed history in order to fit their agenda. So I'd like to end on that note, that we must remember where we come from in order to know where we're going. Thank you very much.